I was 28 years old when I finally understood that the moment my mother struck me was not about anger, it was about control. 10 years earlier, I had stood in a narrow office behind the factory floor, the air thick with dust and oil, holding a letter that represented a future she did not choose for me. Her hand came across my face so fast I barely saw it move, only felt the sting bloom and the room tilt sideways. She told me I was worthless, that choosing my own path made me nothing without her, without the family, without the name that sat on the building outside. I remember thinking how quiet it got after that, the kind of silence that presses into your chest. Years later, when a private plane touched down just beyond those same walls and every voice fell into that same stunned quiet, I realized that silence had been waiting for me all along. The slap echoed longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because no one else made a sound after it happened. The office was small, windowless, the kind of room where decisions were made behind closed doors. A metal desk sat between us, scarred from decades of use. Papers were stacked in uneven piles, invoices, contracts, schedules that dictated the lives of everyone working on the floor below. I could hear the machines running through the walls, steady and loud, like a heartbeat that belonged to the building instead of the people in it. My cheek burned. I lifted my hand instinctively, then stopped, afraid that even acknowledging the pain would make things worse. My mother stood across from me, her jaw set, eyes sharp and unblinking. She did not look surprised by what she had done. She looked relieved, as if the moment had finally aligned with the story she had been telling herself about me. "You think you can walk away from this?" she said, her voice low and controlled. "You think you are better than what we built." I told her I was not trying to be better. I told her I just wanted something different. The words sounded weak even to me as I said them, swallowed by the hum of the factory and the weight of her stare. She told me different was another word for betrayal. She told me everything I had was because of this family, and everything I could ever be depended on whether I stayed in line. Her voice did not rise. That was what scared me most. She spoke like this was a business decision, not a conversation between a mother and her daughter. Behind her, my stepfather leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes fixed on a crack in the paint. He had been part of my life since I was 12, long enough to know exactly how these moments played out. He said nothing. He never did. Silence was his way of staying on the right side of power. My younger brother stood near the door. He looked at the floor like it might open up and swallow him if he stared hard enough. I waited for him to say something. Anything. He did not. The letter in my hand was crumpled now, the edges bent from where my fingers had tightened. I had read it so many times I knew every word by heart. It had felt unreal when it arrived, like something meant for someone else. A chance to leave, to learn, to build a life that was not measured in output and obedience. I had brought it with me because I thought showing her would make her proud. That mistake still made my stomach twist. She told me if I walked out that door, I should not come back. She told me I was no daughter of hers if I chose a future that did not serve the family. The word family landed heavy, like a verdict. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I understood that arguing would not change anything. In her world, disagreement was defiance, and defiance had consequences. I picked up my backpack from the chair by the wall. It was half-packed, clothes stuffed in without care, a few notebooks, my laptop. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and tasted salt. I did not know if it was blood or tears, and I did not stop to check. When I opened the door, the noise from the factory rushed in, loud and sudden. The smell of almonds and machinery filled my lungs. Workers moved along the line without looking up. To them, it was just another day. I walked past the sorting tables, past the loading bay, past the sign with our name painted in bold letters above the entrance. The sun outside was brutal, bright and unforgiving. It felt like stepping into a different life, without warning. I did not turn around. The first thing that hit me once I reached the road was how empty everything felt. Not quiet, exactly, but hollow. Like something essential had been removed, and the space it left behind was echoing. I kept walking because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant admitting that I had nowhere to go. Cars passed me without slowing. The town looked the same as it always had, familiar and suddenly foreign. Every street held memories I was not ready to touch. I did not want to run into anyone who might ask questions I could not answer. I headed away from the factory, away from the house, away from anything that might pull me back. By the time the sun started to sink, my legs ached and my head throbbed. I found a spot near a closed storefront and sat on the curb, pulling my knees up to my chest. I checked my phone even though I knew there would be nothing there. No missed calls, no messages telling me this had all been a test or a misunderstanding. The truth settled slowly, like dust after a long drive. I had been cut off. Not just emotionally, but financially, socially, completely. Everything I had ever relied on had been tied to my mother's approval, and that approval came with strings I could no longer pretend not to see. I stayed there until the streetlights flickered on. When the cold crept in, I stood and kept moving. I told myself I would figure it out. I told myself that people survived worse things every day. I told myself that choosing my own path had to mean something, even if it cost me everything I knew. That night blurred into the next morning. I found a place to rest, a borrowed couch, a door that opened without questions. I did not explain what had happened. I did not trust my voice not to break. Lying there in the dark, I stared at the ceiling and listened to sounds I was not used to. The hum of a refrigerator, a distant train, the quiet breathing of a house that was not mine. My face still hurt. My chest hurt more. I thought about the factory, about the way my mother stood behind that desk like it was a throne. I thought about how easily she had erased me from her life when I stopped fitting the role she had assigned me. I wondered how many decisions in that building had been made the same way, cold and final, without room for dissent. What I did not know yet was that leaving did not end my connection to that place. It only changed the terms. There were things happening behind those walls that I could not see from the outside, decisions being made that would ripple outward in ways none of us were prepared for. As sleep finally pulled me under, one thought lingered, quiet and unsettling. Walking away had been my choice, but the consequences of that choice were just beginning to take shape. Morning came without ceremony. Light crept through the blinds of a room that was not mine and landed across the floor in thin, pale lines. I lay still for a moment, listening to the house breathe around me, the quiet hum of appliances, the soft shift of pipes warming. My face ached when I moved my jaw, a dull reminder of the day before. I pressed my fingers to my cheek and felt the tenderness there, then let my hand fall back to the mattress. I told myself I would not cry. Not yet. There would be time for that later, when things were steadier. I sat up slowly and took in the space. A borrowed room, a borrowed bed, a kindness I had not earned but desperately needed. The walls were bare. The air smelled faintly of detergent and old books. I pulled my backpack closer and checked my phone, even though I already knew what I would find. Nothing. No missed calls, no messages, no sign that anyone from my family had woken up with regret or doubt or even curiosity about where I had gone. That silence weighed more than the slap. It always had. Growing up, silence was how my mother enforced obedience. Words could be argued with. Silence left no opening. It meant wait. It meant submit. It meant come back when you were ready to apologize. I had learned that lesson early, and for years it had worked. This time, I waited for the familiar pull to return, to fix it, to make myself smaller until things felt safe again. The pull did not come. In its place was something colder and clearer. The understanding that if I went back now, nothing would change. I showered quickly and dressed in the clothes I had packed without thinking. Jeans, a sweater, shoes that had walked the same road since I was a teenager. I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. She looked older than I felt, tired in a way that sleep could not fix. I straightened my shoulders and practiced a neutral expression, the one I had perfected at home: calm, capable, unbothered. In the kitchen, my friend moved quietly, careful not to ask questions. She offered coffee and a piece of toast. I accepted both with gratitude that caught in my throat. We talked about nothing: the weather, traffic, a show she had watched the night before. The normalcy was a gift. It gave me space to think. After I left the house, I sat in my car for a long moment before turning the key. This was the part I had been avoiding: the practical reckoning. I pulled out a notebook and began to write down what I had, what I needed, and how long I could last. The numbers were not kind. A small amount of cash. A checking account that would not stretch far. No access to shared resources. No safety net. I wrote it all down anyway. Seeing it on paper made it real and manageable at the same time. My first calls were cautious. I reached out to places that did not know my last name, that would not immediately connect me to the factory or the family behind it. I asked about programs, about work, about housing. The responses were polite and distant. "We will get back to you. Send us your information. We require documentation." Each requirement circled back to the same problem: papers I did not have, records I could not access, forms that had always been handled for me without my involvement. By midday, the frustration began to simmer. I drove to a public library and sat at a computer, scrolling through websites and forums, looking for loopholes. I found stories from people who had been cut off, who had started over later in life with less than I had. Their words steadied me. If they could do it, so could I. I told myself that over and over as I filled out applications and sent emails into the void. The first real blow came quietly. I had an appointment to discuss a short-term opportunity, nothing glamorous but enough to keep me afloat. The conversation was going smoothly until the person across the desk glanced at my resume and paused. Her expression shifted just enough for me to notice. She asked a question about my background, casual on the surface, pointed underneath. When I answered, she nodded slowly and said she would be in touch. The meeting ended sooner than expected. I knew that look. It was the look people gave when they had learned something they could not say out loud. I left with a polite smile and a knot forming in my stomach. In the parking lot, I checked my phone again. Still nothing. That afternoon, I took whatever work I could find: a late shift at a diner off the highway, clearing tables, refilling coffee, smiling when my feet hurt and my head felt heavy. The work was honest and simple. No one cared where I came from or why I was there. They cared that I showed up and did my part. By the end of the shift, my back ached and my hands smelled like grease and soap. I welcomed the exhaustion. It kept my thoughts from spiraling. Later that night, I walked through a quiet neighborhood, delivering flyers for a cleaning service that paid cash. The streetlights flickered on as I moved from door to door. The repetitive motion gave me time to think about how quickly things had changed, about how fragile security could be when it was built on someone else's approval, about how little room there had been in my old life for dissent or difference. When I returned to the borrowed room, I collapsed onto the bed and stared at the ceiling. The house was asleep. I felt awake in a way that was both painful and sharp. I reached for my phone and scrolled through old messages, photos from holidays and workdays, moments that now felt like they belonged to someone else. I stopped myself before I went too far. Nostalgia was a trap. I needed to stay present. The next few days blurred together. Early mornings, long hours, rejections that came in polite emails or not at all. I learned quickly which places asked questions and which ones did not. I avoided using my last name when I could. I introduced myself simply. A woman looking for work, willing to learn. Most people did not look twice. A few did. Those were the ones I avoided. One afternoon, while waiting in line at a small office, I overheard a conversation that made my stomach drop. Two people talking quietly, unaware of who stood behind them. They mentioned the factory, the family, the way things were being handled. One of them said my name, not with concern, but with dismissal, as if I were a problem that had been solved. I stood there, heart pounding, and listened as they spoke about my departure like it was a strategic move, something necessary to maintain order. I walked out before they noticed me. Outside, the air felt thin. I sat on the curb and tried to steady my breathing. It was not just that I had been rejected. It was that my leaving had already been framed as betrayal. That narrative would follow me if I let it. That night, I made a decision. I would stop waiting for doors to open that depended on my family staying silent. I would look for paths that did not require their cooperation or approval. They might have control in some spaces, but not everywhere. There had to be options they did not consider worth guarding. I spent hours researching obscure programs, alternative certifications, independent routes that were overlooked because they lacked prestige. None of them were perfect. All of them required sacrifice. One stood out because it asked for effort rather than pedigree. I bookmarked it and closed my laptop, my mind racing with possibility and fear. As I lay down to sleep, my body finally gave in to exhaustion. The ache in my muscles grounded me. I thought about the woman I had been a week ago, standing in that office, hoping to be seen. I thought about the woman I was becoming, someone who would have to build her life piece by piece without a map. The silence from my family continued, heavy and deliberate. This time, I let it be. I understood now that silence could be a weapon, but it could also be an opening. I drifted off knowing that tomorrow I would take the first step towards something new, something they did not control. And that thought, fragile as it was, carried me into sleep. By the end of that week, exhaustion stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like a signal. It told me when to slow down and when to push, when to eat and when to rest, when to stop pretending that drifting would somehow turn into a plan. I could survive like this for a while, but I could not build anything if I stayed in reaction mode. I needed to choose forward movement, even if it meant choosing a path I had never imagined for myself. I took a day off from chasing shifts and sat at the small desk in the borrowed room with my laptop open and my notebook beside it. The silence felt different now. Not heavy, not threatening, just open. I wrote down what I wanted without filtering it through fear or practicality. I wrote about work that challenged me, about learning something that could not be taken away by someone else's mood, about standing on my own feet without constantly checking over my shoulder. When I finished, I looked at the list and realized something that surprised me. None of it required my family's approval. None of it even required their awareness. The program I had bookmarked the night before pulled me back in. It was small and unremarkable on the surface. No glossy photos, no grand promises. Just a straightforward description of skills, expectations, and work. It did not ask where I came from. It asked what I could do and what I was willing to learn. The requirements were demanding but clear. The timeline was tight. The cost was manageable if I kept working nights and weekends. It was not the dream I had once held in my hands, but it was a door that did not have my mother standing behind it. I applied without overthinking it. When the confirmation email came through, simple and brief, I felt a flicker of something I had not felt in days. Not relief exactly, more like alignment. Like I had placed my foot on solid ground after stepping through fog. The first day I showed up, I almost turned around in the parking lot. The building was plain and worn, tucked between a tire shop and a storage facility. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and dust. People moved with purpose but without urgency, carrying notebooks and laptops, greeting each other with nods rather than forced smiles. No one looked at me like I was an interruption. I found my seat and unpacked my things slowly, aware of every movement. The room filled with a low hum of conversation as people settled in. When the session began, the instructor spoke without flair or intimidation. The expectations were laid out clearly. The work would be difficult. The pace would be unforgiving. Effort mattered more than perfection. No one was promised success. Everyone was given a chance to earn it. As the days passed, I settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Mornings at the program, afternoons reviewing material at the library, evenings and nights working wherever I could. The hours were long, but they were mine. No one monitored my progress with suspicion. No one questioned my motives. When I struggled, the response was guidance rather than punishment. I discovered quickly that I had a way of seeing patterns others missed. It was not something I had ever named before. At home, noticing inefficiencies had been seen as criticism. Asking questions had been seen as defiance. Here, it was simply part of the work. When I pointed out a flaw or suggested an adjustment, the room did not go silent. People leaned in. They asked me to explain. One afternoon, as I worked through a problem set, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. The kind that usually came before I shut down or backed off. My mother's voice surfaced in my mind, dismissive and sharp, telling me I was reaching beyond my place. I paused, took a breath, and kept going. The memory did not stop me this time. It moved through me and passed. The first small victory came quietly. An assignment I had struggled with finally clicked. When the feedback came back, it was brief and direct. Strong work, clear thinking. Keep pushing. I read those words several times, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were earned without condition. No strings attached. No reminder of what I owed in return. Outside of the program, life remained tight. Money came and went quickly. My hands were rough from cleaning and carrying trays. My body learned to sleep in fragments. There were nights when doubt crept in, whispering that I had misjudged my abilities, that the girl who believed she could do more had been naive. Those nights usually ended with me opening my laptop and working until the doubt ran out of energy. As the weeks went on, I noticed small shifts in how people treated me. Not admiration, not attention, just trust. Someone asked for my input without hesitation. Another asked if I wanted to collaborate on a practice project. These moments built on each other, quiet and steady, until I realized I was no longer waiting to be discovered. I was simply showing up and doing the work. Still, something felt off. Not enough to alarm me, but enough to keep me alert. A question here that hinted at knowledge I had not shared. A delay there that did not have a clear explanation. I told myself it was paranoia born of stress. Maybe it was. Or maybe I had learned, the hard way, to listen when my instincts spoke up. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I sat in my car outside the diner and stared at the steering wheel. My phone buzzed with a message from the program, reminding us of an upcoming opportunity. A competitive project that would stretch our skills and put our work in front of people who mattered. Participation was optional. The commitment was intense. The potential payoff was significant. I felt the familiar mix of excitement and fear. Visibility had a cost. Success had a way of drawing attention, and attention had consequences. I thought about the conversations I had overheard, the way my name had been used without me in the room. I thought about how easily narratives could be shaped by those with power. I closed my eyes and pictured the life I was building. Not the one I had lost, not the one I had been promised, but the one taking shape now, slowly and deliberately. I understood then that staying small would not protect me. It would only delay the inevitable. I signed up for the project before I could talk myself out of it. When the confirmation came through, I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. The road ahead would be harder, more demanding, more exposed, but it would be mine. That night, as I lay down to sleep, the ache in my body felt purposeful. I thought about how far I had come in such a short time, and how much further there was to go. I did not know yet who would notice or when. I only knew that I was done hiding, and that the next step would change the shape of everything that followed. The routine settled in faster than I expected. Days began early, not with urgency, but with intention. I woke before the alarm most mornings, my body already trained by necessity, and moved through the quiet hours with a focus that felt new. The program demanded structure, and I gave it willingly. There was something grounding about knowing where I needed to be and what was expected of me, without the constant fear of being watched for the wrong reasons. I learned the building by heart, the creak in the stairs near the back, the way the light slanted through the narrow windows in the late afternoon, the spot by the vending machines where conversations paused and resumed depending on who walked by. It was not impressive, but it was honest. No one pretended it was more than it was. That honesty felt like relief. A few weeks in, I noticed a man who seemed to notice everything without announcing it. He was older than most of us, calm in a way that came from experience rather than authority. He did not hover. He did not praise. When he spoke, people listened because his words carried weight. I learned his name in passing and filed it away, unsure whether he would ever matter to me. The first time he addressed me directly, it was almost an afterthought. He stopped by my desk, glanced at my screen, and nodded once. He said I approached problems differently, not better, just differently, and that difference could be useful if I learned to refine it. Then he walked away without waiting for a response. I sat there for a moment, unsure whether I had been evaluated or warned. Over the next few days, he assigned me work that pushed my limits, tasks that required precision and speed, problems that did not have clean answers. When I made mistakes, he did not correct me immediately. He asked questions instead. What were you trying to achieve? Why did you choose that path? What would you change if you had more time? The process was uncomfortable. It forced me to articulate decisions I had learned to make instinctively. There were moments when the pressure reminded me of home, when my chest tightened and my thoughts raced ahead to imagined consequences. The difference was what followed. Here, difficulty did not come with humiliation. It came with expectation. I was expected to rise to it, not shrink away. Still, I did not trust the ease of it. Experience had taught me that support often came with conditions, and I watched closely for signs of the strings attached. The man noticed my caution. One afternoon, as we reviewed a project together, he asked where I had learned to anticipate failure so thoroughly. The question was casual, but it landed with precision. I shrugged it off, offered a vague answer about experience. He accepted it without pressing, but his eyes lingered a second longer than necessary. That small moment stayed with me. I wondered how much he knew, and how much he could guess. I reminded myself that this was not my family's world. People here did not trade in personal histories the same way, or so I hoped. The work intensified as the weeks passed. Deadlines overlapped. Expectations rose. I found myself staying late more often, the quiet of the building stretching around me as others filtered out. In those hours, I felt most myself, focused, capable, free from performance. I learned to trust my instincts again, to follow a problem until it resolved instead of abandoning it at the first sign of conflict. One evening, I noticed something that unsettled me. A decision had been made to move forward with a solution that cut corners in ways I did not like. It was not illegal. It was not even uncommon. It was simply expedient. When I raised a concern, carefully and without accusation, the response was pragmatic. We do what we need to survive. The implication was clear. Idealism was a luxury. The words echoed something I had heard before, spoken in a different room by a different authority. Back then, survival had been used to justify cruelty. Here, it justified compromise. I nodded and returned to my work, my mind restless. I understood the logic. I also understood where it could lead. Outside of the program, news from home drifted in despite my efforts to stay away from it. A headline shared in passing, a comment overheard at the diner. The family business was mentioned more often than before, usually in tones that suggested strain. I did not seek the information out, but I did not avoid it either. Part of me wanted to understand what was happening, not because I planned to intervene, but because knowledge had always been my way of staying safe. One night, as I walked to my car after a late session, the mentor stopped beside me. He commented on the pace I was keeping and warned me about burnout. His concern felt genuine, not transactional. Then he asked, almost casually, whether I planned to stay long-term. The question carried more weight than it seemed. I answered honestly. I said I planned to stay as long as I was learning. He nodded, satisfied, and said that learning required discernment as much as effort. I asked what he meant. He said that not every door that opened should be walked through without question. Then he left me standing there, the parking lot quiet around me. That night, sleep came slowly. I replayed the day in my mind, the choices I had made, and the ones I had avoided. I thought about the lines I was willing to cross, and the ones I was not. The realization settled in that this place, as different as it was from my past, would test me in ways that felt uncomfortably familiar. The recognition I received grew gradually. More responsibility, access to conversations I had not been part of before, inclusion that felt earned. With it came visibility, and with visibility came scrutiny. I noticed how my work was discussed, how ideas shifted shape as they moved through other hands. I made a mental note to be careful, to document my process, to protect what I built. One afternoon, the mentor acknowledged my contribution in a meeting without using my name. It was subtle, easy to miss, but I caught it. Later, he stopped by my desk and said I had done well, that I should keep my head down and my standards high. I thanked him and watched him walk away, unsure whether I had just been supported or cautioned. As the program prepared for a larger initiative, something that would bring in outside attention and opportunity, I felt the tension build. This was the door he had warned me about. High reward, high risk, the kind of moment that defined trajectories. I weighed the cost carefully. Exposure could accelerate everything I was working toward. It could also invite interference I was not ready to manage. I thought about the woman I had been when I first walked into that narrow office behind the factory floor, hopeful and unguarded. I thought about the woman I was now, measured and alert, learning to navigate systems without losing herself. The difference was not confidence alone. It was awareness. I agreed to take part in the initiative, not because it felt safe, but because avoiding it would have meant denying my own growth. The mentor accepted my decision without comment. He simply nodded, as if he had expected it all along. That night, as I packed up my things and turned off the lights, I felt the familiar mix of anticipation and unease. The path ahead was narrowing, shaping itself into something more defined and more dangerous. I knew that stepping forward would bring consequences. Some I could anticipate, and others I could not. I locked the door behind me and paused in the quiet hallway, listening to the distant sounds of the city. For the first time since I left home, I felt the weight of choice settle fully on my shoulders. Not as a burden, but as a responsibility. I took a breath and walked out, knowing that the next chapter would not allow me to remain unseen, and that whatever came next would demand a clarity I was still learning to claim. The momentum showed itself in small ways at first, the kind you only notice if you are paying attention. Tasks that once took me an entire afternoon now fit neatly into an hour. Problems that used to knot my stomach began to feel familiar, even inviting. People started bringing questions to my desk instead of past it. None of it felt sudden, but together it formed a shift I could not ignore. The larger initiative moved faster than I expected. Meetings filled my calendar. Deadlines stacked on top of one another. I learned how to work while others talked, how to listen without stopping my hands. When my name came up, it was no longer as an afterthought. It carried weight, even if it was not always spoken aloud. I kept my head down and my notes thorough, aware that attention had a way of changing the temperature in a room. The first real win came on a Tuesday afternoon when the building was unusually quiet. I had been asked to review a component that kept failing under pressure. It was not my assignment originally, but I had spent enough late nights with the system to see where it bent and where it broke. I made a few adjustments, tested them carefully, then tested them again. When the results held, I felt a flicker of satisfaction I did not allow myself to linger in. The response was swift and understated. The issue was marked resolved. The project moved forward. Later that day, someone I respected nodded at me in passing and said the work had saved time and money. There was no applause, no announcement, just acknowledgement. It was enough. With that acknowledgement came a subtle shift in how people approached me. Conversations grew warmer. Requests came framed as collaboration rather than direction. I recognized the pattern from my past, the way usefulness invited proximity. I welcomed the opportunity but kept my guard up. Experience had taught me that praise could be the opening move in a negotiation I had not agreed to. It did not take long for the edges to blur. In a meeting, an idea I had developed was presented without attribution. Not stolen outright, just absorbed into the collective language of the room. Team effort was emphasized. Ownership softened. I told myself it was normal, that I was being sensitive. Still, a familiar tightness settled in my chest. At home, erasure had been a tool. I had learned to recognize it. I chose my moment carefully. After the meeting, I approached the mentor and asked a question framed around clarity. I wanted to understand how contributions were tracked and communicated. My tone was neutral, professional. He listened without interrupting, then explained the culture of shared credit and collective success. He said it protected people from individual blame. He said it also protected the work. I nodded and thanked him, but the answer did not settle me. Protection could become a shield for those who took more than they gave. I made a note to be precise in my documentation and cautious in my trust. The pressure to move quickly increased as deadlines approached. Efficiency became the watchword. Decisions were made in smaller circles. I was invited into some of them. In one discussion, a shortcut was proposed that would speed delivery but obscure certain risks. The logic was sound on the surface. The chance of fallout was low, the benefit immediate. When I raised a concern, gently and without accusation, the room went still for a moment. Someone responded that the market did not reward hesitation. Another said, perfection was the enemy of progress. I recognized the language. I had grown up with it, spoken in a different context, but carrying the same meaning. Results mattered more than people. Appearance mattered more than integrity. I agreed to proceed with caution, but did not fully endorse the approach. The decision moved forward anyway. As the meeting ended, I felt the weight of the compromise settle on me. It was not catastrophic. It was not even dramatic. It was simply a step in a direction I did not like. Outside of work, my life remained narrow and disciplined. I kept my shifts at the diner and the cleaning jobs, fitting them around the growing demands of the program. Sleep came in fragments. Meals were functional. I reminded myself that this phase was temporary, that building something solid required endurance. On my breaks, I reviewed notes and tracked progress, making sure my work could not be easily rewritten as someone else's. One evening, as I wiped down a counter long after closing time, I overheard two customers talking quietly at the bar. They mentioned a company struggling to stay afloat, a familiar name slipping into the conversation like a stone dropped into water. My family's business. The tone was not admiring, it was speculative, edged with concern. I kept my head down and listened without reacting. The overlap unsettled me. The world felt smaller suddenly, its networks tighter than I had assumed. I wondered how many connections ran unseen between the spaces I occupied and the one I had left. The thought followed me home and into sleep. The next day brought another test. I was asked to assist with preparing materials for an external review, a chance to showcase our progress to people with influence. The responsibility was significant. So were the expectations. As I worked, I noticed edits being made to my contributions, subtle shifts that changed emphasis and softened conclusions. The revisions were not wrong, but they were strategic. They shaped the narrative in a way that made me uneasy. I considered pushing back harder. I considered staying silent. In the end, I chose a middle path. I documented my original findings and flagged the changes with questions rather than objections. The response was polite, but cool. I sensed the distance immediately, the way warmth could recede without explanation. That distance confirmed what I already knew. Integrity carried a cost. Standing up, even quietly, altered how you were seen. I did not regret it, but I did not underestimate it either. The larger opportunity arrived wrapped in opportunity and expectation, a role with visibility, access to decision-makers, the chance to shape outcomes rather than react to them. It was presented as a vote of confidence. It came with conditions that were not spelled out but understood. Loyalty, discretion, alignment. I took a walk before responding. The air was cool and the streets familiar now. The neighborhood no longer foreign. I thought about the factory office and the way loyalty had been demanded there, unquestioned and absolute. I thought about the silence that followed when I refused. The memory did not hurt the way it once had. It informed me. When I accepted the role, I did so with my eyes open. I clarified expectations. I asked questions others avoided. Some answers satisfied me, others did not. Still, I chose to move forward. Not because it was safe, but because it was necessary to understand the full shape of the system I was in. The weeks that followed were intense. Work days stretched late into the night. The line between collaboration and exploitation blurred further. I watched carefully, noting who took credit and who deflected blame, who listened and who waited to speak last. I learned where power actually lived and how quietly it moved. Through it all, my family remained silent. No calls, no messages. The absence felt deliberate, strategic. I did not reach out. The distance between us became another constant, like the hum of machines in the background of my thoughts. One night, after a particularly long meeting, I sat alone in the empty building and reviewed the day's notes. Patterns emerged when I allowed myself to see them. The compromises, the justifications, the way urgency was used to smooth over discomfort. I realized that success here would require choices I had not fully faced yet. choices about who I would become if I kept climbing. I packed up my bag and turned off the lights, the hallway stretching ahead of me in shadow. I felt tired in a deep way, but also alert. Success was no longer an abstract idea. It was tangible, close enough to touch. So were its costs. As I stepped outside, the night air cooled my skin and steadied my thoughts. I understood then that this phase was not just about advancement, it was about defining my limits before someone else did it for me. The opportunity in front of me promised more influence than I had ever held. It also demanded a loyalty I was not sure I could give. I walked to my car and paused with my hand on the door, listening to the quiet. The next decision would not be small. It would shape not just my work, but the direction of everything that followed. I drove home knowing that whatever came next would test me in ways success never had, and that the price I would be asked to pay had not yet been fully revealed. The call came on a morning that looked exactly like every other one. I was halfway through a cup of coffee, skimming notes from the night before, my mind already moving through the tasks ahead. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt fragile. I had learned to live inside that thin layer of stability without leaning on it too hard. My phone vibrated once on the desk. I almost ignored it. The number was unfamiliar, local, but not saved. I let it ring twice before answering, already forming a polite excuse in my head. When I put the phone to my ear, the voice on the other end was professional and measured, the kind of tone people use when emotions would only complicate things. The caller introduced himself as a consultant working with several regional operations. He said he was reaching out because my name had come up in connection with a potential review. He paused, just long enough for the weight of that sentence to land, then said the name of the business I had not spoken aloud in years. I did not respond right away. I sat very still, the room suddenly too quiet. He continued, unaware or unconcerned with the impact of his words. He explained that the company was facing significant strain. Cash flow issues, vendor pressure, regulatory attention. He said the situation had escalated faster than expected and that external eyes were now unavoidable. I thanked him for the information and said I would need time to consider whether I was the right person to speak with. He agreed easily, as if he had expected hesitation, and ended the call without urgency. When the line went dead, I stared at my phone until the screen dimmed. I did not feel satisfaction. I did not feel fear. What I felt was a slow tightening in my chest, the kind that comes when the past pushes its way into the present without asking permission. I went through the motions of the morning on autopilot. Shower, dress, drive. The city moved around me like it always did, indifferent and loud. Inside, everything had shifted. I realized how carefully I had built distance from that world, how deliberately I had avoided learning what became of it after I left. Not out of denial, but out of self-preservation. At work, I kept my focus narrow. I answered questions. I attended meetings. I took notes I did not immediately need. The call replayed itself in the background of my thoughts, every detail sharpening with repetition. The phrasing, the pauses, the way my name had been used. Not as family, but as leverage. During a break, I stepped outside and sat on the low concrete wall near the parking lot. The air smelled like dust and heat. I tried to identify what unsettled me most. It was not that the business was in trouble. That outcome had always been possible. It was the way the information had reached me, stripped of emotion and obligation, as if the years between had collapsed into a single transaction. Later that afternoon, another piece fell into place. A colleague mentioned, casually and without context, that a leadership change was rumored at a mid-sized operation downstate. He did not name it outright, but the description was unmistakable. I listened without reacting, nodding at the appropriate moments, my mind already connecting threads. By the time I drove home, the decision not to decide felt heavier than making one. I parked and sat in the car with the engine off, the ticking sound loud in the quiet. I thought about the people who worked there, the ones whose lives had been measured in shifts and seasons, not ownership and control. I thought about how quickly a collapse would ripple outward, touching people who had nothing to do with the choices at the top. No one had asked me for help, not directly. The silence from my family remained intact, dense and unbroken. The expectation, I realized, was that I would notice, that I would understand my role without being invited. Silence had always been their way of pulling me back into alignment. That night, I did something I had not done since I left. I opened public records. I read financial summaries. I traced patterns that were not meant to be obvious. The picture that emerged was worse than what I had been told. Debt layered on top of debt. Short-term fixes masking long-term damage. Decisions made to preserve control rather than stability. One name appeared repeatedly, tied to transactions that raised more questions than answers. A relative by marriage, someone who had been trusted with authority while I had been dismissed as a liability. The realization did not shock me. It clarified something that had always felt off. The business had not been mismanaged by accident. It had been protected from accountability. I closed my laptop and leaned back in the chair, the weight of the knowledge settling into something solid. This was not about proving anything. Not to them. Not to myself. The girl who had walked out of that office had already done the hardest part. What remained was a choice about who I wanted to be now. Over the next few days, I gathered information quietly. I spoke to no one connected to my family. I asked questions through channels that did not lead back to me. I listened more than I spoke. The deeper I went, the clearer my position became. I had leverage, whether I wanted it or not. The question was what to do with it. I thought about walking away, letting the consequences unfold without interference. It would be clean, justified. They had made their choices. I owed them nothing. The thought brought no relief, only a hollow sense of finality that did not sit right with me. I thought about stepping in openly, calling my mother, naming the problems, offering solutions. The image made my stomach tighten. That path would pull me back into the same dynamics I had fought to escape. Control framed as concern, obligation disguised as reconciliation. The answer, when it came, was quieter. I would not engage as a daughter. I would not engage as a savior. If I stepped in at all, it would be on my terms, through structures that did not bend to family pressure. At work, I continued as if nothing had changed. I met deadlines. I contributed where expected. Inside, my focus sharpened. I began to think in longer arcs, not just about my role, but about positioning, about how power moved when it was not announced, about how influence could be applied without exposure. One evening, as I packed up to leave, the mentor stopped by my desk. He asked if everything was all right. The question was simple, but his gaze was steady. I told him I was managing a few things. He nodded, then said that timing mattered as much as talent. He said some doors only opened once, and some only closed when pushed. I thanked him and left without asking what he meant. I already knew. At home, I laid out everything I had learned, the vulnerabilities, the assets, the timelines. There was one point of entry that stood out, a contractual hinge that could not be adjusted quietly. Any movement there would be noticed. It would force conversations that had been avoided for years. I closed the folder and turned off the light, the room falling into darkness. My heart beat steadily, not fast, not slow. I felt no rush of revenge, no urge to confront. What I felt was control, the kind that comes from seeing the whole board. The next phase would require patience and precision. It would also require stepping closer to the world I had left, without stepping back into it. I lay down knowing that the silence between us was about to change shape, and that when it did, it would no longer belong to them alone. I began by stepping closer without being seen. There were no calls to make, no doors to knock on, no announcements to prepare. I approached the situation the same way I had learned to approach complex work, quietly, methodically, with an eye for structure rather than drama. Distance gave me clarity, and clarity gave me options. I worked through intermediaries who had no reason to connect me to the past I had left behind. Advisors who spoke in numbers and risk assessments. Firms that treated interest as curiosity, not intent. Requests went out framed as routine due diligence, the kind that happened every day in industries built on pressure and timing. No one questioned it. No one asked who I was beyond what was required on paper. The picture that formed was stark. The company was not limping, it was hemorrhaging. Short-term fixes had been layered over long-term damage until the foundation itself had begun to crack. Credit lines were stretched thin. Obligations had been deferred in ways that could no longer be hidden. Decisions that looked bold on the surface were revealed as desperate when examined closely. What struck me most was how familiar it all felt. The same patterns I had grown up watching from the sidelines were now visible in spreadsheets and filings. Control prioritized over sustainability. Image protected at the expense of truth. Dissent silenced by authority rather than addressed with reason. My absence had not caused these problems. It had simply removed a voice that might have named them earlier. I kept my emotional distance intact. Every instinct I had told me not to romanticize what I was seeing. This was not a tragedy unfolding in isolation. It was a consequence long in the making. Still, consequences did not fall evenly. They rarely did. The people most likely to pay the price were not the ones who had made the decisions. Through my proxies, I learned how fear had begun to ripple through the ranks. Workers worried about hours. Suppliers tightened terms. Longtime partners grew cautious. Leadership responded the way it always had, by pulling control closer, by limiting information, by treating transparency as weakness. From the outside, the pattern was obvious. From the inside, it was probably suffocating. Updates about my mother filtered through indirectly. Her name appeared in communications marked urgent and confidential. Her posture, according to those who observed it, had shifted. Where she had once commanded with certainty, she now managed with tension. Meetings ran longer. Decisions stalled. The authority she relied on began to fray at the edges. I felt no rush of satisfaction. Distance had done its work. What I felt instead was a calm resolve, the kind that comes when you know exactly where you stand. This was not about reclaiming a place. It was about understanding leverage. There was one point in the structure that mattered more than the rest, a hinge buried in contractual language that tied several obligations together. If it moved, everything else would follow. It was not something that could be adjusted quietly. Any attention there would ripple outward, forcing conversations that had been postponed for years. I tested the waters with a limited move, a question raised through a firm with no emotional investment, a request for clarification that required documentation rather than explanation. The response came quickly, edged with concern. Meetings were scheduled. Advisors were pulled in. The atmosphere shifted from guarded to alert. Inside the company, confusion followed. Leadership scrambled to understand where the pressure was coming from. Speculation filled the gaps left by incomplete information. I watched the reactions with professional detachment, noting how quickly defensiveness replaced strategy. The force they felt was real, but its source remained unclear. That anonymity was my advantage. I did not need to rush. Each step confirmed what I already suspected. They were unprepared for scrutiny that did not bend to authority. Their usual tools did not work when the question was not who, but how. At the same time, I made sure to understand the human cost. I asked my intermediaries about workforce stability, about contingency plans, about the likelihood of layoffs if certain thresholds were crossed. The answers were cautious but honest. A collapse would not be clean. It would spread outward, touching people who had no voice in the decisions that led there. That knowledge sharpened my intent. Any action I took would need to separate accountability from destruction, justice from cruelty. I had lived long enough under the weight of someone else's power to know how easily it could be misused. As the pressure mounted, signs of suspicion began to surface. Leadership questioned whether the interest was coordinated. Names were floated. Outside influence was discussed in hushed tones. Still, my name did not appear. That silence felt different from the one I had grown up with. This silence was uncertainty, not punishment. I continued my work as if nothing had changed. My days remained full, my focus intact. At night, I reviewed updates and adjusted timelines. The distance between who I was and where I had come from felt measured now, not raw. I was no longer reacting. I was planning. One evening, as I closed my laptop, I realized how thoroughly the roles had reversed. Once, my future had been decided in a small office behind a factory floor, without my consent. Now, the fate of that same enterprise was shifting in response to questions I had authorized, without my presence required. The symmetry did not make me smile. It grounded me. The next move would require visibility. There was no way around it. The hinge I intended to move could not be touched anonymously. It would force a meeting, a reckoning, a recognition of authority that could not be dismissed as rumor or misunderstanding. I considered the timing carefully. Not too early, not too late. I prepared quietly. Documents assembled. Positions clarified. Travel arranged without fanfare. I chose not to inform anyone who might leak intention through anxiety or misplaced loyalty. Control, I had learned, was maintained through restraint. The night before the next step, I slept deeply. No dreams of the past. No rehearsed confrontations. Just rest. When I woke, my thoughts were clear and unburdened. Whatever came next would change how they saw me, but it would not change who I was. As I stepped into the day, I understood that anonymity was about to end. The silence that had protected me would soon give way to recognition, and recognition would demand composure rather than reaction. I moved forward knowing that the moment I revealed myself would not be an appeal for understanding, but a statement of position, and that once made, it could not be taken back. The first sign that the ground was shifting came through someone else's tension. I noticed it in the clipped emails, the sudden urgency where there had once been delay, the way meetings multiplied without clarity. When pressure becomes visible, it means control is slipping. I had seen it before, just not from this side of the equation. The request for a formal meeting arrived late in the afternoon, routed through legal counsel and written in language that pretended neutrality. They wanted to discuss options. They wanted to clarify intent. They wanted to understand the scope of interest behind the inquiries that had disrupted their usual rhythm. My name was not mentioned directly, but the implication was unmistakable. The time for shadows was ending. I agreed to the meeting without negotiation and specified the terms with care. Neutral location, defined agenda, advisors present, no surprises. The response came back quickly, almost too quickly, confirming every condition. Urgency has a way of revealing itself even when wrapped in courtesy. I arrived early on the day of the meeting, not out of nerves, but habit. The conference room was clean and impersonal, all glass and polished wood. It smelled faintly of recycled air and fresh coffee. I set my folder on the table and took a seat that allowed me to see everyone as they entered. Control of space matters more than people admit. They arrived in pairs and singles, avoiding my eyes at first, then studying me openly once recognition settled in. Some faces were unfamiliar, professional, and guarded. Others carried history, whether they wanted to or not. My mother entered last. Time had changed her, but not softened her. The sharpness was still there, tempered now by strain she could no longer hide. She looked at me as if I were an unexpected variable rather than a daughter. That suited me. Familiar roles had no place here. The introductions were brief and formal. Titles replaced relationships. My name was spoken without commentary, stripped of the context that once defined it. I appreciated that. When the meeting began, the focus stayed on numbers and obligations, on timelines and contingencies. No one referenced the past. No one needed to. As the discussion unfolded, I listened more than I spoke. Questions were raised about liquidity, about risk exposure, about the consequences of inaction. Answers came carefully, shaped to minimize vulnerability. When deflection appeared, it was subtle, embedded in language meant to reassure rather than resolve. At a natural pause, I spoke for the first time. I clarified the scope of my interest and the conditions under which I was willing to proceed. My voice was steady, my tone measured. I outlined the realities as they were, not as anyone wished them to be. There was no accusation in my words, only precision. The effect was immediate. Postures shifted. Notes were taken more quickly. The conversation narrowed. My mother watched me with an expression I recognized. Not anger, not disbelief, but calculation. She was reassessing the balance of power in real time. When she finally spoke, it was to question my authority, framed as concern. She referenced experience and legacy, the weight of history. I let her finish without interruption, then responded with facts she could not dismiss. Ownership structures, contractual obligations, the leverage created by deferred decisions. Each point landed cleanly, without emotion. The room grew quiet, not tense, but attentive. This was no longer a discussion about whether intervention was needed. It was about how and by whom. I did not address my mother directly again. Instead, I spoke to the group as a whole, outlining a path forward that protected operations while separating accountability from control. The proposal was clear. The terms were firm. Acceptance would require relinquishing authority. Rejection would accelerate collapse. The choice was theirs, but the consequences were not negotiable. A break was called to review the materials. People stepped out in small groups, voices low, movements quick. I remained seated, reviewing my notes, aware of the weight of the moment without being consumed by it. This was not confrontation. It was alignment. When the meeting reconvened, the tone had changed. Questions were sharper, more focused. Resistance softened into negotiation. The inevitability of the outcome began to register. I answered what needed answering and deferred what could wait. Control is often exercised by knowing when not to respond. My mother said very little after that. When she did speak, it was to ask whether this was about revenge. The question was quiet, almost private, but it carried years of accusation. I met her gaze and answered honestly. I said this was about responsibility, about correcting a trajectory that threatened more people than either of us. She did not argue. The absence of rebuttal spoke louder than anything she could have said. The agreement was not finalized that day, but the direction was set. Papers would be drafted, terms refined, authority transferred through proper channels. The machinery of change moved forward, slow but unstoppable. As the meeting ended, people gathered their things with the careful movements of those adjusting to a new reality. My mother lingered, watching me as if waiting for something else to happen. An apology. A reckoning. I offered neither. There was nothing left to resolve between us here. I stood and gathered my folder, nodding politely to those still seated. As I walked toward the door, I felt the weight of years lift without ceremony. No triumph, no satisfaction, just the quiet certainty of having stepped fully into my own authority. Outside, the air felt cooler than I expected. I paused for a moment on the sidewalk, letting the noise of the city fill the space where tension had been. The next phase would be complex, demanding, and visible. Implementation always was, but the hardest part was already done. I walked away, knowing that the balance had shifted permanently, not because I had returned, but because I had chosen how. The silence between us had been broken, not with words, but with consequence. And from here on, there would be no confusion about who was deciding what came next. The work that followed was quieter but heavier, the kind that settles into your bones rather than announcing itself. Authority does not arrive with noise. It arrives with paperwork, timelines, and the slow realization that decisions now pass through your hands whether you feel ready or not. I returned to my daily routines with a sharper edge. Mornings at my desk stretched longer. Evenings filled with calls that were measured and precise. The agreement began to take shape through drafts and revisions, each version stripping away ambiguity until only intent remained. Control shifted in increments, not gestures. That was intentional. Sudden change invites resistance. Structured change forces adaptation. Inside the company, the atmosphere tightened. Managers adjusted their language. Meetings became shorter and more focused. The reflex to defer upward faltered when the usual authority no longer answered the way it once had. I watched the transition closely, not from satisfaction, but from responsibility. Stability mattered more than victory. The first visible consequence arrived when an internal review halted a project that had been draining resources quietly for years. The decision was framed as strategic, but everyone understood what it meant. Shortcuts were no longer protected. Familiar names no longer shielded risk. Accountability was no longer selective. That shift unsettled more than it reassured. People who had thrived in ambiguity struggled under clarity. Others, the ones who had kept their heads down and their work clean, began to step forward. Patterns revealed themselves quickly when pressure changed direction. I spent more time on the ground than anyone expected, walking the facility, speaking with supervisors, listening without interruption. I did not introduce myself as anything other than what I was now responsible for. Titles create distance, presence builds trust. The workers responded cautiously at first, then with growing openness. They asked practical questions. They wanted to know whether their jobs were safe, whether their routines would change, whether the future would resemble the promises they had heard before. I answered what I could honestly and acknowledged what I could not. Credibility grows faster when you admit limits. My mother remained mostly silent. She attended required meetings and signed necessary documents, but her voice no longer shaped the room. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Power, once lost, does not announce its departure. It simply stops responding. There were moments when she looked at me as if expecting something else, a confrontation, a reckoning, a return to familiar roles. I offered none. The past had already been spoken into existence years ago. There was nothing new to say now. As weeks passed, resistance took new forms: delays, omissions, quiet noncompliance disguised as confusion. I addressed each instance with the same calm insistence: documentation, follow-up, consequence, not punishment, but correction. The message traveled faster than any announcement could. Outside the company, attention grew. Industry watchers noticed the changes. Suppliers adjusted their tone. Confidence returned cautiously, tested before extended. I fielded inquiries without spectacle. Visibility was unavoidable now, but I controlled how it manifested. Influence does not require explanation when results speak clearly. In the midst of it all, my own life shifted in ways I had not anticipated. The routines that once anchored me felt lighter, less urgent. I reduced my outside shifts gradually, replacing survival work with strategic focus. The exhaustion that had once defined my days softened into something more manageable. Purpose has a way of reorganizing energy. There were nights when I drove home late and sat in the car longer than necessary, letting the quiet settle. I thought about the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming, not in terms of success, but in terms of agency. I no longer waited for permission. I no longer measured myself against someone else's expectations. The contrast sharpened when I received a message through an intermediary asking whether reconciliation was possible. The word felt out of place, as if applied to a situation that no longer existed. I declined to respond. Boundaries are not negotiations. They are decisions. At work, the mentor who had once watched me from a distance acknowledged the changes with a single comment. He said this was what leadership looked like when it was not driven by fear. Then he moved on. The validation mattered less than the accuracy. One afternoon, I found myself standing near the edge of the property, watching operations continue with a steadiness that had been missing before. Machines ran without frantic adjustment, schedules held, people moved with a confidence that came from knowing what was expected and why. It was not perfect, but it was honest. That mattered. The internal audit concluded with recommendations that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Divestments, restructuring, transparency measures that limited individual discretion. The board approved them without debate. Momentum, once established, resists reversal. The final transfer of authority was scheduled without ceremony. No announcement, no gathering, just signatures and filings that changed the legal reality beneath familiar routines. When it was done, the silence that followed felt different. Not empty, complete. I did not seek my mother out afterward. There was no need. Whatever understanding might exist between us would not be forged in this context. Power does not repair what control has broken. It only clarifies what remains. As I left the site that evening, I noticed how little it pulled at me emotionally. The land was the same, the buildings unchanged. What had shifted was my relationship to it. I was no longer bound by memory or obligation. I was simply present. Driving away, I considered what came next. Implementation would continue. Challenges would surface. Systems would need adjustment. None of that frightened me. Complexity never had. What mattered was that the foundation now supported the weight placed on it. Later that night, I reviewed a message from my legal team confirming the finalization of the structure. The words were precise and unemotional. Control established. Responsibilities defined. Risks mitigated. I closed the file and turned off the screen, feeling a quiet satisfaction that did not ask for recognition. The chapter that had begun with uncertainty was ending with clarity. Not the dramatic kind, the durable kind. I lay awake longer than usual, not from anxiety but from awareness. Life had shifted again, this time not by force but by choice. The next phase would ask different questions. Questions about scale, about direction, about how much of myself I was willing to invest now that survival was no longer the goal. As sleep finally settled in, I understood that the hardest work was not behind me. It was simply changing shape. And whatever came next would not be about proving my worth, but about deciding how to use it. The days that followed settled into a different kind of rhythm, one shaped less by urgency and more by intention. The immediate crises had passed, replaced by the steady work of building something that could last. That kind of work does not reward speed. It rewards patience, attention, and the willingness to sit with discomfort until clarity emerges. I spent more time thinking about the future than reacting to the present. Expansion was no longer theoretical. Opportunities presented themselves through conversations that began cautiously and ended with quiet confidence. Partners who once hesitated now asked questions that assumed stability rather than survival. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. One opportunity stood out, not because it was flashy, but because it aligned with how my life had evolved. It involved mobility, efficiency, and the freedom to move without apology. The idea took shape slowly, tested against practicality and cost, weighed against necessity rather than desire. When the decision finally made itself, it felt less like a leap and more like a natural progression. The first time I stepped onto the small aircraft, the sensation surprised me. Not awe, not triumph, but familiarity. Control panels and quiet hums made sense to me in a way I had not expected. Systems spoke a language I understood. There was comfort in that. Independence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it feels like recognition. Learning to fly required discipline and humility. It demanded attention in a way few things had since my earliest days of rebuilding. The instructor was patient and direct, uninterested in my background or reasons. He cared only about precision and safety. I appreciated that. The sky does not negotiate. It responds only to competence. As hours accumulated and confidence grew, I noticed how the act of flying changed my perspective. Distance rearranges priorities. From above, boundaries blur. What once felt heavy shrinks into proportion. The experience grounded me rather than lifting me away. It reminded me that control, real control, comes from understanding limits, not denying them. The aircraft became a tool, not a symbol. It allowed me to move between responsibilities without friction, to be present where I was needed without explanation. Time stretched differently. Days felt fuller, not longer. I no longer measured success by how much I endured, but by how deliberately I chose. News of my return reached the community before I arrived. Curiosity traveled faster than intent. By the time I touched down near the property, people were already watching, their expressions a mix of surprise and disbelief. I noticed the stillness first, the way conversations paused and resumed in hushed tones. Familiar ground does not always feel welcoming, even when you stand on it with authority. I stepped out calmly, dressed without flourish, carrying nothing that invited commentary. The air smelled the same, earth and machinery. Some things resist change. I nodded to those who acknowledged me and moved forward without hesitation. Presence does not require announcement. My mother was not there when I arrived. I did not expect her to be. Avoidance had become her preferred response to situations she could not control. Others approached cautiously, offering greetings that carried more curiosity than warmth. I returned them politely and kept moving. This was not a visit. It was a transition. The meeting that followed was procedural, focused on timelines and implementation. No one mentioned the aircraft directly, but its presence lingered in the room like an unspoken fact. Power does not need explanation when it arrives intact. Later, as I walked the perimeter alone, memories surfaced uninvited. Not sharply, not painfully, just present. I remembered being told this place was my only future, that leaving meant failure. Standing there now, I understood how small that definition had been, how limiting. Futures are not inherited, they are built. My mother appeared near the edge of the field as the sun lowered. She stood at a distance, watching rather than approaching. The years between us filled the space more effectively than words ever could. When she finally spoke, it was not to apologize or accuse. She asked a question that revealed more than she intended. She asked how I had done it. I answered simply. I said I had chosen myself when no one else would. The words hung between us, unchallenged. She nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact she could not undo. There was no reconciliation in that moment. No forgiveness offered or requested. What passed between us was understanding, limited and incomplete, but real. Sometimes that is all closure looks like. As I left the property again, lifting into the quiet evening sky, I felt a sense of completion that surprised me, not because everything was resolved, but because it no longer needed to be. I was not running from the past or proving a point. I was moving forward because that was who I had become. The horizon stretched wide ahead of me, clear and unburdened. I guided the aircraft with steady hands, aware of every movement, every response. Control felt earned, not seized. Responsibility felt chosen, not imposed. When I landed later that night, far from where the story had begun, I carried that clarity with me. The future was no longer something I waited for. It was something I navigated deliberately, one decision at a time. As I shut down the engine and stepped back onto solid ground, I knew the final chapters would not be about confrontation or triumph. They would be about meaning, about what remains when the noise fades and only truth is left. I walked away from the plane with an easy stride, already thinking about what I would build next, and how carefully I would protect the life I had claimed for myself. Morning came softly, without the sharp edges that once defined my days. The light through the window felt steady, not urgent, and for a moment I lay still, listening to the quiet. This was the space I had worked toward, the kind where thoughts arrive without panic and leave without leaving scars. The weeks after my return settled into something close to normal, though normal no longer meant small. Responsibilities expanded, not dramatically, but with intention. Meetings turned into plans, plans turned into systems. Systems began to hold on their own, which was always the goal. I had learned the hard way that nothing truly lasts if it depends entirely on one person's force of will. I spent time where it mattered, not to assert presence, but to understand flow. People adjusted. Some easily, relieved to work without fear of sudden reversals. Others resisted quietly, clinging to habits that once protected them. Change exposes what comfort hides. I addressed what needed addressing and let the rest surface on its own. Control works best when it is applied sparingly. My mother kept her distance. We crossed paths occasionally, always in public spaces, always brief. Our conversations were limited to logistics and updates. The absence of conflict felt strange at first, like standing in a room after the noise has stopped and wondering what will fill it. Over time, I understood that silence can be honest when it is chosen. There was one afternoon when she asked to speak privately. Not formally, not urgently, just a request delivered without the old edge. We sat at a small table near the edge of the property, the sounds of work carrying on around us. She did not look at me when she began. She spoke about pressure, about fear, about how things had gotten away from her. She stopped short of apology, but she did not defend herself either. I listened without interruption, not because I owed her that space, but because I had learned the value of letting people hear their own words. When she finished, she asked if I understood. I told her I did. Understanding did not require agreement, it required clarity. She nodded, accepting the boundary without pushing against it. The conversation ended without resolution, and that was enough. Closure does not always arrive with answers. Sometimes it arrives with the absence of further questions. As the operation stabilized, I turned my attention outward again. Opportunities appeared that would have felt overwhelming once. Now they felt manageable, even familiar. I chose carefully, guided less by ambition and more by alignment. The work I accepted had to support the life I had built, not consume it. Flying became part of my routine, not as an escape, but as a connector. I moved between places with purpose, carrying decisions rather than avoiding them. Each flight reminded me how far I had come from the girl who once walked away with nothing but determination. Perspective does that. It turns distance into understanding. One evening, as I prepared to leave after a long day, a supervisor stopped me. He thanked me for the changes, not the visible ones, but the quiet ones, the way questions were answered, the way mistakes were addressed without humiliation, the way trust was rebuilt without speeches. His gratitude was simple and sincere. I accepted it without deflecting. That moment stayed with me. It was not validation I had been chasing, but it was confirmation that power could be exercised without damage. That authority did not have to bruise to be effective. At home, my life had grown spacious. Meals were unhurried. Sleep came easily. I spent evenings reading or walking, letting my thoughts wander without direction. The constant readiness that had once defined me softened into awareness. I was still alert, still engaged, but no longer braced for impact. There were nights when memories surfaced unexpectedly. The office above the factory floor, the words that cut deeper than the slap, the certainty with which my future had been dismissed. Those memories no longer triggered anger. They carried information, nothing more. They reminded me why boundaries mattered, why self-trust had been so hard won. I realized then that I no longer needed the past to justify the present. My life stood on its own terms now. That freedom brought responsibility of a different kind. The responsibility to choose well, to protect what I had built, to not recreate the patterns I had escaped. As the season shifted, I felt a sense of readiness settle in, not for confrontation, not for proof, but for reflection. The story that had unfolded was no longer raw. It had shape, meaning. I began to understand what I wanted to carry forward and what I was willing to leave behind. One quiet afternoon, I walked through the property alone, not inspecting, not evaluating, just observing. The rhythm of work continued without my input. That was the true measure of success. Systems that endure without constant oversight. People who trust process more than personality. I paused near the edge of the field and looked out across the land. I felt no ownership in the way I once had been told to feel. What I felt was stewardship, care without possession, responsibility without entanglement. It was enough. Later that night, I sat at my desk and reviewed the last few months. Not through reports or metrics, but through moments. Decisions made calmly, conversations held without fear, silence that no longer felt like punishment. The through line was clear. I had stopped seeking permission to exist as myself. That realization brought an unexpected tenderness. For the younger version of me who had endured uncertainty without language, for the woman I had become who learned to speak anyway. Growth does not erase pain, it contextualizes it. As I prepared for sleep, I thought about what I wanted the final chapter of this story to say. Not in words, but in presence. I wanted it to reflect steadiness, dignity, the quiet strength that comes from knowing you can walk away without losing yourself. The next day would bring its own demands, its own decisions. I was ready for them, not because I had hardened, but because I had softened in the right places. Resilience is not rigidity, it is flexibility guided by values. I turned off the light and let the darkness settle. Tomorrow did not need to be conquered, it needed to be met. And for the first time in a long while, I felt fully prepared to do exactly that. I did not feel like a hero when it was over. I felt like a woman who had finally stopped asking the wrong people to tell her who she was. That realization came to me in a simple moment, standing in my hallway as I took off my shoes, the house quiet, my hair still smelling faintly of wind and fuel from the airfield. It was ordinary, almost boring, and it made me smile because for so long my life had been anything but. When I was younger, I believed my mother's voice was the voice of reality. If she called me worthless, then there had to be truth in it. If she said the family business was my life, then resisting it must be selfish. That is how control works. It does not just demand obedience, it colonizes your sense of self. Breaking free from that took years. It took distance, yes, but it also took repetition. Repeating the truth to myself until it felt real. Repeating the choice to keep going, even when I was tired, even when I was lonely, even when it would have been easier to crawl back and accept whatever scraps of belonging they offered. I built my life in a way that would have looked unimpressive to anyone obsessed with appearances. I worked, I studied, I failed quietly and tried again. I learned to live without a safety net, which forces you to become your own net. I learned that discipline is a form of love because it protects your future self. I learned that staying in a toxic family system is not loyalty, it is self-abandonment. By the time success found me, it did not feel like magic. It felt like math. Effort compounded, skills matured, opportunities aligned with preparation. And when independence became real, when I could move through the world without permission, I understood the most important thing. I understood that nothing they did could erase who I was if I refused to participate in their story about me. Then the family business began to collapse, and the universe did what it often does. It brought the past back, not to punish me, but to test whether I would step into old roles again. The call I received was not emotional, it was clinical. Debt, risk, possible shutdown. And in that clinical language, I heard the same old expectation. Come back. Fix it. Save us. Accept the role we assigned you. The difference was, I did not feel pulled. I felt clear. I could have ignored it. Some people would have celebrated that as revenge, watching karma play out. I will admit, a part of me wanted that. The part that remembered the sting, the humiliation, the way my future was treated like a toy that could be crushed in someone's fist. But I also remembered the workers, the families, the community. I remembered that consequences rarely land where they belong unless someone forces them to. So I chose a form of payback that did not require cruelty. I chose to intervene in a way that protected the innocent and removed the guilty from control. I chose legality over screaming, structure over drama. I chose to let the tables turn through reality rather than theatrics. When I arrived and they saw the aircraft, the shock in their faces was not just surprise at my success, it was fear. Fear of the hidden truth becoming visible. Fear of losing the control they had used like currency. They had built their identity around being the ones who decide. Watching me step into that role without asking permission was unbearable for them because it proved they were never the source of my worth. In the end, I did not take everything. I did not humiliate them publicly. I did not need to. The consequence was enough. They lost what they had misused. The business continued for the people who deserve stability. The community did not have to collapse because of one family's ego. That was justice. And what did I keep? I kept my dignity. I kept my boundaries. I kept my ability to sleep at night without replaying arguments in my head. I kept my life. There is a moment after you break free from a toxic family pattern where you realize you are allowed to stop explaining yourself. You are allowed to say no without a speech. You are allowed to walk away without rehearsing reasons that will never be accepted anyway. That moment is terrifying at first. Then it becomes peaceful. Then it becomes normal. That is where I am now. Not in bitterness, not in longing, in peace. If you are listening and you are still stuck in the part where you feel guilty for wanting more, I want you to remember this. People who benefit from your sacrifice will always call your independence selfish. That is how they protect their comfort. Your job is not to keep them comfortable. Your job is to keep yourself whole. And if you have been excluded or betrayed or manipulated, If you have watched favoritism poison a family, if you have been told you owe someone your life because they share your blood, I hope my story gives you one clear message. You can choose your own path. You can build a future that does not require their blessing. You can let karma do its work, and you can still choose justice over cruelty. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for sitting with me through the hard parts. If you feel comfortable, leave a comment and tell me what resonated, or tell me what you would do if you were in my shoes. And if you want more stories about revenge, betrayal, inheritance drama, and the kind of closure that protects your dignity, like the video, subscribe, and stay here. There is more coming, and I would love to have you with me for the next one.